All right, we're back for part two of this is Ken Morefield with Jeffrey Overstreet there. We're continuing to discuss the arts and faith top 100 films and Jeffrey's essay on Blue. Um, Jeffrey, when we got cut off, you were discussing a little bit about the term spiritually significant
Yes.
and how that maybe morphed through your interactions of watching Blue, or at different periods of your life focusing on maybe different elements of a film that would make you find it spiritually significant. Am I summarizing semi-accurately?
I was talking a little bit about how rather than seeing this film as explicitly Christian,
Mm,
I was reading sort of the poetic elements of the film, and I'd mentioned that we see Julie wearing a cross necklace, and so in my early experience with film, right away I was zooming in on that and thinking, oh, okay, what does that mean? Is that a symbol? Um, and I've come to believe over watching the film, 20 or 30 times now, that it's actually a profound symbol, but the film is full of them.
mhm,
And in the case of the cross, for example, we learn that this is something that her husband gave her as a sign of love. She loses it in the car accident that takes her family. It is returned to her by a hitchhiker who happened to witness the accident, and she rejects it. She rejects the gift. And you could read that in the essay. I go into this in great detail. You could read this as a rejection of faith. She's not going to go back to the language of faith. You could see it as a rejection of her husband's gift because perhaps she is suffering too much the loss of him, or maybe at this point in the film, I think there's enough evidence to suggest that maybe there's an inkling of doubt about the nature of relationship with her husband already
mhm.
that's been sort of chewing on her. And that might be why she's reluctant to reconnect with this gift from him. Maybe it's rejection of what he was claiming was true. Um, but it's also one of those moments when I think Kieslowski is very aware of the danger of being preachy, the danger of seeming too sanctimoniously solemn in his um, religious inquiry. So he pairs that moment with the cross with the crassest moment in the film, perhaps, or one of the two crassest moments in the film. When the boy gives her the cross back, he also mentions that he heard her dying husband's last words. And that leads to an exchange when we find out that the car accident happened as he was telling a really disgusting joke. And I won't take time here to explain the joke, but I think it's hilarious. But it's also not just a joke. It's an incredibly crass joke, but it's a joke about relieving oneself
Mhm.
of pressure that has built up within them, of suffering that they've been going through. And so even the dirty joke can be read as an underlining of the film's central theme,
Mhm.
which I think is part of Kieslowski's genius. That even a throwaway joke, if there were ever, God forbid, a fart joke in a Kieslowski movie,
Mhm.
it would probably be profound and make us think about God or something. I don't know, but I guess that's what I'm
Think
talking
Ozu
about.
made a whole movie about fart jokes. I think if I forget the title, but he has the family time or whatever. So uh,
Right. So that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about when I think is this film spiritually significant?
mm,
Um, is it inevitable that in engaging with this film, we're going to find layer upon layer upon layer of meaning and question and mystery and symbol and poetry that is going to lead us to sort of professing what we believe and wrestling with the questions that kind of shape our lives. So, um, what I like about that is that means this conversation about 100 films is open to just about anybody.
Hmm.
And as a Christian, I think that's the way it should be. I don't think the purpose of the list is to convert anyone to Christianity, but to invite people into a conversation where we are all learning, because I think a sincere Christian is someone who knows that they don't know.
Which
It's
is also
someone,
why, there are many films on the list that are not Christian, where
yeah,
spiritually significant
absolutely.
spirituality is not just limited to one institutional, religion.
Yeah. I mean, we've got, A Serious Man is on the list, which the Coen brothers made about growing up, in Orthodox Judaism.
Hmm.
Um, Cave of Forgotten Dreams is on the list, which
Hmm.
takes you back to the earliest artistic and perhaps religious expression
Hmm.
in human history. Um, um, Ozu is on the list. There's just so many avenues of conversation that I think anybody could find meaningful dialogue and even meaningful relationships, as I don't know you and I have found to be true,
Hmm.
that develop because of these conversations. So
One of the words that you used a couple times in describing your thoughts about, spiritually significant, in the part right before the to preach, was true. You
yeah,
use the word true and truth a lot. um and I find that to be a good anchor for myself. I've quoted a couple times in my own writing, Ken Gire's famous axiom of, I'd rather be told an R-rated truth than a G-rated lie. um and I think about the prominence of truth in you know Paul's admonition in Ephesians of, whatever is good, whatever is beautiful, whatever is right, think on these things. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Sherry Truffin, responded with, like, why does everyone forget the first word in that list is whatever is true? And so I think, if there, and of course no one film is going to embody, you know, the entire truth of human existence. But I think that means that, there's going to be far more than 100 films that can embody some facet of truth or some part of truth that can make us understand, truth, or enlarge our, our conceptions. So for me, a lot of times when I think about what makes a film spiritually significant, it is not necessarily whether it's Christian or Muslim or Jewish, but whether or not it is truthful about the way that it depicts Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, or people who hold those hold those tenets. Um, and I think they give us a wonderful context for both examining our own notions of what we think is true, and talking about our own notions of what we think is true in a respectful way with people who maybe have other notions or different notions. um that, because the film is like Blue, it's very concrete. At the end of the day, it touches on all of these abstract or big questions, but it does through the particular experiences of one particular woman. And it's and then the particular experiences of our interacting with that in the film theater, our experience of watching it and coming to understand her experience is very personal and particular. And I think film has this sort of unique ability, which the films on the top 100 list do really well, of um embodying, or dare I even say incarnating, these huge questions in manageable experiential chunks that can bring the conversation forward, even though it's never going to end. Um,
yeah. I think I'm glad you brought up the Philippians 4:8 reference. I actually just quickly scanned through the essay here because I find that I end up quoting that verse far too often, and I'm surprised that I don't quote it here in,
Hmm.
in this essay. It's an exception, but yeah, that applies perfectly. And um, I think another thing that's particular to this film, that's something I didn't really fully appreciate until the Criterion Collection edition came out, was that when I saw the film for the first time, and I talked about the music that keeps haunting Julie.
Hmm.
Um, Eventually, we get to the text that her husband intended a chorus to sing
Mm.
with this music that would represent the hope of the unification of Europe. And the text plays, and the subtitles did not provide it for me when I saw the film for the
Mm.
first time. And then strangely, I remember just being boggled by this. At the in the end credits of the film, suddenly the text for 1 Corinthians 13 showed up on the screen. And I was like, what is happening?
Yeah.
This is the famous love chapter. Most
God
people are
has
familiar with
broken
this.
through the universe and started writing on movie
Yeah,
screens.
yeah. Is this just like acknowledgments or something?
Mm.
Like, thank you, 1 Corinthians 13. I was like, is that? I remember coming away thinking, is that what they were singing? And then the Criterion Collection edition makes that
Hmm.
explicit, and I think other video releases have made it explicit too. But I remember just being so frustrated, like we should know what they are singing if it's that important to the film. How could you not subtitle it as the chorus sings it?
Mm.
Because wow, does that blow open possibilities for interpreting this film? Are
Hmm.
we to understand that Julie, in her wrestling with this music that's following her around, is really wrestling with the question of whether she will embrace Christian faith, or just the idea that God is love and that in order to know God you need to love? Or some I've read interpretations of this film that find it fundamentally cynical, that the film has illustrated that that kind of love is almost impossible in interpersonal relationships, certainly impossible on a global scale. And here we are in 2024, and I think it would be even easier now to read the
Hmm.
film as cynical. Um, Kieslowski was a cynical guy. In interviews, he really resisted any. Forgive me, I live on a very busy street, and
Hmm.
sometimes people are drag racing. So if you're
Oh wow.
hearing strange noises in the
I
background,
didn't hear. I saw you look. Yeah.
I also live right next door to a fire station. So if you hear
Uh-huh.
sirens, there's no emergency here anyway.
Okay. We hope.
um,
Yeah.
so that those I love the flexibility of this text, that it can be
Hmm.
read so many different ways. And I think I'm always more interested in a film's questions than its answers. And I'm
Hmm.
also far more interested in a filmmaker who seems to be learning something himself, herself, themselves. Um, does the artist have a posture of, I am investigating something and excited about this, come along with me? Or is it more this kind of posture? I have a point I want to make. And
Hmm.
boy, that reminds me of a certain kind of Christianity that I'm tired of. A
Yeah.
very confrontational, judgmental, pious in the sanctimonious sense of the word.
You will submit to the supremacy of my logic and the intractable truth of my position as presented to you via this text.
Which is
Um.
why so much quote unquote Christian art is terrible,
Yeah.
is because it is crafted with didactic intent.
So
And
that might be a good segue to the other question that I typically ask my authors about. Um, we talked a little bit about not being limited, spiritually significant, not being limited to Christian films. The 2020 list, there's been either 5 or 6 arts and faith top 100s, depending on if you count the 204 list that was not ranked. Um, the 2020 list was unique in that we limited the list to one film per director, um, in an attempt both, I think, to get some new films on there, but also because some of us were dismayed that uh, the original voting was, had, I think, only four female directors. And so hoping that we could have maybe more international films, more films of color, and particularly more women directors. Um, I'm not sure how successful we were that we went from four to six. I think there were six female directors on the that did get
Yeah,
us in: Ava DuVernay, Selma, and I think Jessica Hosner's Lords, which Stephen Gradanis wrote about in his chapter, um,
yeah, such a great film.
as well as the standbys of uh the Iranian leper film, whose title I always forget, and Agnes Varda and Claire Denis.
Mhm.
How did you feel? I remember you during the voting as being someone who was pretty solidly on the side of let's limit it to one film by director, because we really want to be or need to be more inclusive of artistic expressions of truth from a wider variety of artists than what we're getting. Am I remembering that correctly? And how did you feel
Yeah,
about
I
the
think
outcome?
so. I think so. I'm a little, I mean, as I was considering some of the questions you wanted to explore today, I was realizing, wow, it's been a while, and
Hmm.
some of this is foggy in my memory. But I remember
Well,
being so
2025 is just around the corner. Stephen and I were like that. Maybe it's time for, every 5 years. And
sure. I think that is an excellent improvement of the list, because it acknowledges that this is a very flexible list. We all know these are not the best films of this kind. That's such a subjective question. And just the fact that the list has changed so dramatically, coming from relatively the same group of voters, or at least largely the same group of voters, year after year after year, shows you that this represents people in flux, people who are
hmm
growing and changing and learning. And one of the hardest lessons I've had to learn is not only how, I suppose it's not too harsh to say, prejudiced I have been in earlier versions of myself, and I'm sure that I still have a lot of prejudice to outgrow, but how influenced we all are by systemic corruption and weaknesses in how films are produced and categorized and distributed, and whose films get made. Um, there are very few women directors on this list,
hmm
and I do not believe that is because there are very few relevant films by women. I think it's probably because it's really hard to find them. It's gotten easier. I think in recent years there has been some very encouraging signs of change in the industry, and that we are seeing a lot more films made by women get distribution to the big screen. But we are also finding, thanks to the internet, and thanks to zealous apologists for great filmmakers of all kinds, we are finding films that we didn't know existed, that have been around a long time, and that have been known to other great filmmakers who've been influenced by them.
hmm
So I feel like it would be great to do another list soon and see, hopefully we would see even more evidence that we are learning. It's not just that, I mean, I would never say that there weren't, um, that women weren't a tremendous influence on a lot of these films that ended up with a male director's name stamped on
hmm
them. It's such a collaborative form. This is one of my discomforts with auteur theory.
Yes, I'm totally with you on that as well.
So, I mean, if I look over this list, I mean, I think about all the interviews I've heard with Juliette Binoche about Three Colors Blue, and
Right.
how Kieslowski really respected everything she brought to the table. And so it's kind of funny, she's listed as the lead actress. Well, yes,
hmm
definitely, but so much more than that.
Well,
And
is
of
Tim
course,
Robbins the author of Dead Men Walking, or is Helen Prasian the author of Dead
that's
Men
a
Walking,
perfect
or is Susan Sarandon the, so
it's a
yeah.
perfect example. And maybe that would be something to think about for the next list, is that when we publish the list, we publish the name of the director and the writer,
Mhm.
or the author of the original text that the film is based on. Maybe that would help.
Right.
Um, but it's not just um, um, male directors, female directors. It's directors of all kinds from all over the world, and I
Mhm.
want to see, if I and this is something that clashes, I think, with strains of Christianity we see making a lot of noise right now. The scriptures I read tell me that the kingdom of God is a celebration of every tribe and every nation.
Mhm.
And it would make sense to me that um, any sort of summary of great influential films, truthful films, beautiful films, would have selections from all over the world, every tribe and every nation. So
Mhm.
the more we reflect that, I think the more excited I am about this list and what purpose it might serve. So, but yeah, every list has been a little different, and it really did make a difference to narrow it to one director, or to one film per
Mhm.
director. It allowed us to have a much greater variety, and hopefully these single films will
Mhm.
serve as breadcrumbs leading to other great films by those directors. Because on the other hand, if I look
Mhm.
back at the 2011 list, for example, wow, there are some hugely important films that can't be on the new list because we've already got another film by that director.
Right.
Uh, so yeah,
Well, I mean,
there was a
I mean,
cost.
yeah, we agonized in terms of like, like Ordette, or, you know, the Passion of Joan of Arc or whatever, and it was just like, I forget who it was, one of the voters just being like, how can you have a top 100 list of the most spiritually significant films and not have the Passion of Joan of Arc? And I was also
Right.
like, yeah, but how can you not have Ordette? And if you
Yeah.
start breaking the rules for one, you know, but I appreciated what Stephen Gradanis had to say, about that. I think he was very pragmatic, and in terms of just saying, at the end of the day, there's no one right answer between the two of them, and he'd much rather have a representative list of 100 great authors, because it's not like someone's going to be like, oh, I've discovered this list, I'm going to watch Ordette, that was incredible, and not go like, has that person done anything else? Or, I'm never going
I
to
would
watch
hope so.
Passion of Joan
Yeah.
of Arc now. Um,
Yeah.
Speaking of which, you had mentioned like mostly the same people. It's been interesting to me that since Arts and Faith was discontinued as a discussion board, um, the, there's been a slow churn, and I mostly became aware of that after in years that we don't do the top 100 list. There's been a tradition of doing a top 25 themed list, and last year's theme was crime and punishment. And one of my colleagues in the North Carolina Film Critics Association, Lindsay Dunn, did a podcast with one of her colleagues about that. She had never been involved in the arts and faith list, and it was interesting for them talking about like I don't know, they'd go through the list, and I think number 25 on the crime and punishment list was, Steven Spielberg's Catch Me If You Can. Um and I forget if it was Lindsay said, or her colleague had said, like, okay, this is first time ever on any arts and faith list, any of the theme lists or whatever. Wow, I'm really surprised. Doesn't there have to be at least one Spielberg film on, every list or whatever? And I was like, okay, new generation that has different, like, because I was like, a couple of, I was most surprised, not necessarily by the films that were on the list, but by they're like, I can't believe this has never been on an arts and faith list before in terms of changing. Um, I forget what other, like Anatomy of a Murder or whatever, had. I was like, this is perfectly fine. By the same token, like Evan Cogswell and I, who were long time on the arts and faith board, were just like, I'm a little embarrassed and a little, you know, chagrined that like the arts and faith top 25 crime and punishment list could come out and not have High and Low by Kurosawa and not have M. But I mean,
Yeah.
M was the one where my jaw just dropped when I tabulated all of the results and being like, where I was almost like, I've never actually, as an editor or a vote counter, been put my finger on there, but I was just like, okay, God, can we actually have this list without M?
Yeah.
And it was
Because
just a
that
new
urge to,
generation of young film critics,
yeah.
fresh out of college, who I'm like, they haven't gotten to it yet, and when they
Yeah.
will, they'll.
Yeah.
But I'm like,
Well,
you were there.
I'm
But I'm like,
still,
you were there once too. There was a time
yeah,
in which,
I'm still
Doug
there. I
Doug
mean,
Cummings was coming on the Arts and Faith Board and talking about Robert Bresson, and I'm like, never heard of the guy. Baltazar, whatever. And so,
yeah.
they'll find it eventually. But I mean, I think that's one of the power of the Arts and Faith sort of list is, um, this is going to sound very Christian, but not just implementing or imposing our judgments and saying this is our take, but also passing down from one generation to the next, or somehow preserving what it is that we've learned through the interaction on those websites, or what it is that we've acquired, um, and then making room for people to have their own experiences and add to that. In a tradition, it's hard to give up some of the films that you really love, but it's exciting to see new voters and new blood equally passionate about some of the things that were very influential in their lives.
Yeah, and
Um,
there's still several films on the list I haven't seen before. And
yeah,
I mean, I saw High and Low for the first time just this year. I mean,
yeah,
I didn't start really watching films until late high school, and I
mm-hmm,
still have so much to go back and
yeah,
discover, even as I try to keep up with all the good stuff that's coming now. But now it's like with streaming, it's just a fire hose trying to keep
mm-hmm,
up with all of the stuff that's available every year, while also giving yourself a history lesson, an
yep,
ongoing history lesson.
to really
That's one of the
balance
great,
to really
yeah,
balance that, old classic versus new.
yeah.
Let me maybe in that spirit conclude with a quick question. I had asked Stephen Gradanis when we talked about his essay about maybe one film or two films from the 2020 list that, because it was the gap between 2011 and 2020 had maybe the biggest turnover or churn.
Mhm.
One film that he was maybe either particularly sad to have lost from the previous list, and one film that he was particularly happy to have gained or gotten back. Like he mentioned Witness finally returning to the list, which hadn't been on there since 2004. And he was like, I was really glad to see that come back, or whatnot. Was there or is there something in scanning over the list, something that you were really sad to have lost or really happy to have gained?
Well, if we're talking about films that we lost because of the decision to go to
Yeah.
one film per director, boy, I highlighted several here that I was sorry to see go. Apocalypse Now, Days of Heaven, Dogville, Tarkovsky's Mirror, Vendors, Paris, Texas. But the one that really, I mean, we already mentioned The Passion of Joan of Arc,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm just like, how does this have any credibility if that film isn't on the list? But of course, Burdett.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the one that probably hurts the most is the Dardenne brothers, The Sun.
Mm-hmm.
That is a film that over the years has just consistently risen in my estimation. It's in my top 10 of all time when it comes to favorites. It's such a seemingly simple film. You know, it almost does the Dogma 95 thing of
Hmm.
no enhancements of music or special lighting or anything. It's just so realistic. Um, and it's just about a carpentry teacher who takes a particular interest in one of the boys in his class of boys who are trying to um, start life over after some trouble they've gotten into. And this one um, troubled kid, he sort of begins to mentor more closely. And we are worried about the nature of that relationship because the film doesn't give us any exposition. And I remember being so nervous in the theater watching this film, going, is this about what I think it's about?
Hmm.
And I was so worried it was going to become a story about a pedophile or something.
Hmm.
And instead, when you learn what's really going on between this man and this boy and their history, it becomes for me um, not only a story I believe is happening as I'm watching it.
Hmm.
The actors are so perfect, and the Dardenne brothers are so good at
Hmm.
that naturalism. Um, it's also just one of the most profound spiritual parables I can think of in cinema. Um, and I, that's one of those things. If I were showing people the 2020 list, I would say, but please note, you've got a
Yes.
movie here called The Kid with a Bike
Hmm.
by the Dardenne brothers, which I is a great film. No
Hmm.
argument there. For me, it doesn't stand quite as it doesn't loom as large as The
And
Sun
I
does.
wanted 2 days, one night,
Yeah.
which,
Well,
but yeah,
La Promesse, Rosetta, so many of their
yeah,
films. So that was tough to lose. But when it comes to what we gained, going back through it, I mean, I cannot believe that we didn't have Dead Man Walking on the list before that. We didn't have. I mean, First Reformed, of course, is fairly recent, and while I'm
yeah.
not a big fan of that film, it has certainly stirred up discussion
Hmm.
in ways that few films like this have done. The one for me probably that I'm most well, gosh, I'm gonna have to mention two. The Tree of Life.
Hmm.
Not my favorite Malick film, but the film by Malick that I think belongs on this list,
Hmm.
and that Roger Ebert considered one of the 10 greatest films ever made. I mean,
Hmm.
that is so central to discussion. But I also want to mention Silence by Martin Scorsese
Hmm.
um, um, as a film that I think is going to belong on this list for many lists to come because of the how it wrestles with questions that I don't think any other film wrestles with quite as profoundly and with such complexity, and it leads moviegoers to such an extraordinary novel as well. So yeah,
Right.
those are some that come to my mind.
Okay, well, so I'm getting a little countdown on my
Yeah, me
Zoom
too.
recording account that says 6 minutes. So any last questions or comments or anything that you want to shout out before I let you go? I really appreciate you sharing your insights and experiences about Blue and the Arts and Faith Top 100 list. But I do want to give you the last word if you've got anything else that I haven't asked you about or that you want to add.
If we had time, I would love to point uh, anybody who's watching this or listening to this to in so many other directions when it comes to other writers who have these questions at the center of their passion for cinema and who are writing either in um, uh, harder to find places or at the New York Times. I mean, there was a time when Alyssa Wilkinson was a part of this conversation, and she is now a New York Times film critic. And I think if you read her reviews, it will not be hard for you to find that she has these questions
Yeah.
on her mind and heart. Stephen Gradanis is doing great work, and he's in the New York Film Critics Circle. He writes at decentfilms.org and has a new Substack. Um, there are so many writers who started in this conversation and then went on to publish and
Mm-hmm.
have found platforms of their own who are writing for important newspapers, websites, journals of all kinds.
Yep,
So
Matt. If you are seeing this via the Arts and Faith webpage, Matt Page wrote his Bible 100 Bible Films book for BFI.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
Darren,
definitely. The list goes on and on in terms of like people who met and sharpened one another through the Arts and Faith site, and are either, have written elsewhere or continue to write elsewhere. So that's
I
absolutely
owe a
the
great
call.
deal to Darren Hughes. I just on Facebook this week shared again um, an essay he wrote on Ron Howard's adaptation of Hillbilly Elegy,
Hmm.
the memoir slash novel by J.D. Vance. Um, Controversial book, controversial film. Darren Hughes wrote profoundly about it, and he,
Mm.
one of the most influential arts and faith
Yep.
voices in my life. But also, I want to highlight Lauren Wilford, who I don't remember which lists she voted on,
Yeah.
or if she did, but she was part of an influential voice in our community for a while, and she's gone on to write one of those books in Matt Zoller Seitz's series about Wes Anderson.
Hmm.
She wrote the big book on Isle of Dogs
Hmm.
with her husband Ryan Stevenson. She's also written a beautiful, maybe the sort of definitive essay on My Neighbor Totoro. And I can say that with some confidence because if you buy like the special anniversary edition of My Neighbor Totoro on Blu-ray, it comes with Lauren's essay.
Right.
I use that text in my film
Hmm.
class. It's such a beautiful thing. So this community uh, wasn't just a little pocket of Christian movie
Yep.
nerds, although maybe for a while that's kind of what we were.
Yeah,
But it's been
I'll put a couple links in the YouTube, on the
great.
first comment because like you mentioned Darren Hughes. Of course, he wrote an essay on Pedro Costa for Faith and Spirituality and Masters of World Cinema.
Yeah,
Matt Zeiss did the intro for I think volume 2 or 3
right.
of that series. So yeah, everything's connected, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm glad we're connected, So
Yeah.
thank you, Jeffrey, for sharing your insights and time, and for your contribution on Kieslowski's Blue. The name of the book is Film as an Expression of Spirituality, the Arts and Faith Top 100 Films, and you can find a link. It's just this week available in paperback. So maybe not have to break your break your wallet if you if you want to check it out. So um Jeffrey, thank you
Thank you
so
for
much.
all of your work on that book. Thank you so much for your work on that book. I'm glad it's out there.